Hey guys, tonight we're telling the story of Margaret Pole, one of the last surviving Plantagenets, and the woman whom Henry VIII ordered to be executed in the year 1541 in a brutal and controversial manner that even historical records seem to tremble when describing. She was not beheaded with a clean single stroke like other nobles. There was no proper scaffold. There was no formal sentence. There was only a low block set up hastily, an inexperienced young executioner, and clumsy axe blows that struck her shoulder, her skull, and her back one after another while she was still alive and still able to feel the pain. Witnesses called it one of the most shameful executions of the Tudor reign. And the most painful part was that she was innocent. She did not rebel. She did not plot. She did not challenge the throne. The only things that made her a target were her bloodline, her faith, and her existence in a time when the crown trembled at names that made it uneasy. Tonight's story is the slow unraveling of a woman swallowed by history, misunderstood, treated as a threat simply because she did not disappear at the right moment. This is not a loud tragedy, but a quiet one, where the manner of death speaks louder than the life lived. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we continue, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. There's something fascinating about someone drifting into sleep in New York while someone else in Texas, Florida, or Washington relaxes in the stillness of their own evening, listening to the same story, yet in entirely different moments of time. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. One of the last members of the Plantagenet line was Margaret Pole. She held no ambition to claim the crown of England, no dream of ruling, no restless hunger to challenge the order of kings. Yet her life would lead her toward a death that was horrific, clumsy, and deeply unjust. Her long lifetime unfolded through a realm where the throne changed hands again and again, shifting from monarch to monarch, and among those crowned figures were two of her own uncles. Margaret survived each of these political storms, staying at the edges of danger, moving quietly, never pushing forward, never allowing anyone to accuse her of reaching for power. But her steady Catholic faith, calm and unwavering, would eventually become the stone that caused her to fall. She entered the world on the 14th day of August, in the year 1473, born within the walls of Farleigh Castle near Bath. Margaret had one brother named Edward, and the two of them were the only surviving children of their parents, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, and Isabel Neville, daughter of Richard Neville, the famous Earl of Warwick. Her maternal grandfather, Richard Neville, had already died 2 years before she was born. He fell at the Battle of Barnet, fighting against Margaret's own uncle, King Edward IV. From the earliest threads of her story, the tone becomes unmistakable. This was not the life of an ordinary woman. This was the life of someone born into a network of bloodlines, where every name carried weight, where alliances shaped kingdoms, and where family ties pulled history forward like a heavy tide. These noble connections lifted her high above common society, but they also bound her to a fate she could never escape. Her heritage was not simply a mark of honor, but a burden, a chain, a sign written upon her from the moment she opened her eyes. Even as a child, before she could understand the meaning of ancestry, the world had already decided who she was. The death of her grandfather in battle fighting against his own kin cast a shadow across the cradle where she lay. England was divided, and those fractures ran straight through her family tree. The wars for the crown were not distant matters. They shaped the hall she walked, the whispers she heard, and the future waiting patiently ahead of her. For Margaret, the throne was not a symbol. It was the force that shaped safety, danger, loyalty, accusation, and survival. As she grew, the kingdom around her shifted like sand beneath her feet. Kings changed, loyalties dissolved, accusations replaced alliances. From this world, Margaret learned that survival belonged not to the bold, but to the silent and unseen. She never made claims. She never challenged the line of succession. She never reached for anything that did not belong to her. But history does not always leave the quiet untouched. Her lineage was too clear, her ancestry too direct, her bloodline too close to power. Even without speaking, she was noticed. Even without action, she was suspected. Even without ambition, she was dangerous in the eyes of those who feared her name. Margaret was marked by forces older than she was. The path of her life had already taken shape long before she was born. A name, a bloodline, a crown she never wanted, and a fate moving towards her slowly and silently like a shadow stretching across the floor at dusk. After the death of her grandfather, Margaret's father, George was granted the additional titles of Earl of Warwick and Earl of Salisbury, strengthening the position and wealth of the family. Yet behind those gleaming names was a temperament that could not be trusted. George had long been known for being hot-tempered, impulsive, and at times aggressively unpredictable, but it would take many more years before others fully recognized the extent of his instability. Margaret's mother, Isabel, died in the month of December in the year 1476, when Margaret was only about 3 years old and Isabel herself was only 25. Today, people believe she died of consumption or a fever after childbirth, but at the time, George was convinced that his wife had been poisoned. From that belief, he created a tragedy that settled over the household like a heavy fog. He accused one of her ladies-in-waiting, Margaret Pole, of poisoning Isabel. Without clear evidence, he stormed into Margaret's home, dragged her out, stripped her of her jewels, and hauled her straight to a rushed and makeshift trial in Warwick. Local justices were forced to attend only to serve as decoration, because everyone understood they had no choice but to agree with the accusation made by a powerful duke. George declared that Margaret had given Isabel a poisoned drink of ale on the 10th day of October, and the jury was compelled to pronounce her guilty. Margaret was taken from the courtroom to the jail and then directly to the gallows, all within a few hours on the very same day. Later, King Edward IV issued a posthumous restoration of her innocence, but they could not reverse the cruelty of her death. The injustice had already been done, and the stain of it did not wash away. The memory lingered silent and sharp like a blade resting against the edge of a sleeve. Margaret's childhood, though lived inside a household of rank and wealth, was overshadowed by this act of brutality, by the knowledge that power could be used without restraint, and by the quiet fear that lived in the eyes of servants. She remained in her father's home, surrounded by nursemaids and waiting women, but it was clear that this was not a warm household. It was a place where the volatile mood of her father and the ghost of a wronged woman hovered in the background. The death of Isabel left Margaret without the gentle presence of a mother and without the stability that might have softened the atmosphere of the home. George's emotional instability cast a long shadow, and although Margaret was far too young to understand the details, the tone of her early life was shaped by lost suspicion and the unpredictable grief of a man who could not control himself. Those around her may have tried to shield her from the darkest truths, but children feel what is not spoken, and Margaret grew within walls that had seen accusation, coercion, and death. The rushed execution of Margaret Pole became an unspoken echo within Margaret's upbringing, a reminder that authority could turn violent when guided by fear and obsession. Even though George believed he acted in certainty, the lack of evidence, the forced jury, and the speed of the sentence showed a man ruled more by impulse than reason. For Margaret, this formed the quiet undercurrent of her early world, the knowledge that innocence offered no protection and that the powerful could destroy without consequence. Thus, Margaret's earliest years were not shaped by peace, but by a fragile balance between nobility and dread. Her surroundings were elegant, yet heavy with what had been done. Her caretakers tended to her needs, yet carried fear in their silence. Her father held titles and influence, yet remained unstable and unpredictable. This was the air she breathed, a world where privilege and unease existed side by side, and where every soft moment carried the echo of something darker beneath it. There are not many detailed records describing how close Margaret was to her father, but since he died when she was still very young, and since he spent much of his time at court or abroad, it is likely that the two of them were not truly bonded. After the death of Isabel, George began to pursue another marriage, this time aiming for Mary of Burgundy, the stepdaughter of his sister, but the daughter of one of the wealthiest and most powerful rulers in Europe. Mary was young, beautiful, and most importantly the sole heir to the Duke of Burgundy, a court that was considered the richest and most refined in Europe during that time. But King Edward, who had long been suspicious of his unstable brother, refused to approve the match. George grew furious, left the court, and having once rebelled and been pardoned, now pushed matters even further. The atmosphere around him became thick with distrust and tension. In the year 1477, the astrologer of Clarence John Stacey was tortured and forced to confess that he had foreseen the death of the king. Under pressure, he named a chaplain and one of George's retainers, Thomas Burdett. All three were charged with treason, and only the chaplain escaped execution by a last-minute reprieve. At that point, George himself had not been directly implicated, and if he had remained silent, the matter might have ended there. But he did not stop. He had a declaration of innocence written by Burdett read aloud before the royal council as though openly challenging the authority of King Edward. That act became the final straw. Edward summoned George back to court, accused him of treason, and had him imprisoned in the Tower of London. A bill of attainder was introduced stripping George of his rights and property. He was convicted and secretly executed on the 18th day of February in the year 1478. Rumors later whispered that he had been drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine, a drink he was said to favor, but the story remained forever wrapped in uncertainty, neither proven nor disproven. What was certain, however, was that George died branded as a traitor, and all the lands and titles of the family were seized by the crown. For Margaret, the consequences were immediate and irreversible. Her father's disgrace meant that everything that should have belonged to her through inheritance was no longer hers. The estates were no longer under her family's control, and the prestige that once wrapped around the name Plantagenet was stained by treason. Margaret and her brother Edward became children without status, without security, and without the protections that noble birth once promised. Their future now lay in the hands of others. The effects of the attainders stretched far beyond property. It meant that the very name of their father could not be spoken with honor. It meant that Margaret was marked not by her own actions, but by his downfall. It meant that her childhood became divided into two halves, the brief years when she was the daughter of a powerful duke, and the long years when she was the orphan of a condemned traitor. She was still surrounded by the trappings of nobility, yet she stood outside of it, caught between what she had been born into and what she was now allowed to be. The shift was not loud. It did not arrive with sudden shock. It settled slowly like dust over a room that had once been filled with light. Margaret would have been too young to understand the legal language, the accusations, the politics behind the execution. But she would have understood what had changed. Servants spoke more softly. Doors closed more quickly. Invitations no longer arrived. The world around her contracted. Her brother Edward, too, became a figure suspended in uncertainty. The crown now held the power to shape their lives, to control where they lived, and to decide what future role, if any, they might play. The fall of George was not only the end of a man, it was the collapse of a family's position, and Margaret stood at the center of that collapse, unable to alter it, unable to resist it, and unable to escape the shadow it cast. Thus, the next stage of her life began not with opportunity but with displacement. The titles were gone, the protection was gone, the security of lineage was gone. And from that moment forward, Margaret's life would be shaped by forces outside her control, forces triggered by a father whose choices she could not influence and whose consequences she could not avoid. After her father's lands were taken, Margaret and her brother Edward had to leave the familiar world they had known and live within the royal household under the supervision of their cousins belonging to the king's family. But when Margaret was only 10 years old, the world shifted once again. On the 9th day of April, in the year 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly. The crown was meant to pass to his 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, who would have become Edward V and who was also Margaret's cousin. However, that future never came to pass. Prince Edward and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury were taken to the Tower of London by their other uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, supposedly to await the coronation. While they were held there, Gloucester announced that he had discovered evidence that the marriage of Edward IV had been invalid, and therefore his children had no right to inherit the throne. Then, presenting himself as reluctantly stepping into duty, he accepted the crown and became King Richard III. The two young princes vanished from sight, and history has continued to argue for centuries about whether they were murdered or secretly removed and hidden away. Whatever the truth may have been, by the month of September in the year 1483, Richard III was king, and the sons of Edward IV were no longer publicly seen or acknowledged. This turn of events placed the daughters of Edward IV, along with Margaret and her brother Edward, among the next potential heirs of the House of York. From a legal standpoint, the attainder against their father did not technically prevent them from being viewed as having royal blood. Yet Richard declared that this was enough to block any claim from young Edward. And so Margaret and her brother were sent to live at Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire. They were treated properly and provided for given care and protection, and there were even rumors suggesting that if Richard and his wife Anne Neville failed to produce a child, Edward might be considered as a possible successor. Though such speculation was unlikely to become reality, it revealed the truth. Beneath the surface, Margaret was not merely a forgotten girl, but a presence that mattered even when she asked for nothing. Her life at Sheriff Hutton would have felt suspended, as though she lived in a space between safety and danger. The walls around her were secure, yet the reason she was there was rooted in fear and caution. She was sheltered yet watched. She was honored yet contained. Her brother carried even greater weight, for his existence alone reminded the realm that the blood of the Plantagenets had not vanished. Margaret, though still a child, would have understood the shift in how people looked at her. Respect mingled with unease, courtesy softened by caution. Her lineage spoke for her louder than her voice ever could. The disappearance of the princes created a silence that echoed across England, and that silence settled into Margaret's life as well. The question of inheritance, the uncertainty of succession, and the invisible tension between houses all threaded themselves into her days. She did not choose to stand close to the throne. She did not wish to be seen as a threat, but she'd been born into a family where choice had little meaning. The blood that ran in her veins placed her in the center of a game she never entered. At Sheriff Hutton, she lived under the care of those appointed to oversee her, but she also lived under the shadow of possibility. If Richard III and Anne Neville had no heir, her brother might have been lifted upward. If the princes were confirmed dead, the line could bend toward her family. If rumors shifted, if loyalties changed, if accidents occurred, Margaret's place could transform overnight. And yet, she never reached towards any of these paths. She did nothing except exist, and existence was enough. Thus, her youth became a quiet lesson in how power behaves. Those who wanted it reached for it and risked everything. Those who possessed it guarded it fiercely. And those who merely carried the potential for it, as Margaret did, were watched controlled and positioned like pieces on a board they did not move. In the deep halls of Sheriff Hutton, surrounded by careful comfort, Margaret learned that danger did not always roar. Sometimes it breathed softly beside her, waiting. As time passed, the lives of Margaret and her brother shifted once more. Her brother left Sheriff Hutton and returned to London under the guardianship of Thomas Grey, the first Marquess of Dorset. In the year 1485, when Anne Neville, who held the title of Countess of Salisbury, died, Richard appeared to restore the title to Edward, increasing the young boy's status and wealth. But all of these plans dissolved quickly when Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth in the month of August in the year 1485, and Henry Tudor became King Henry VII. The new king relied upon the claim of conquest to hold the crown and strengthened his position by marrying Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. Even so, anyone who looked closely at the bloodlines could see that Margaret's brother Edward still occupied a position that might be dangerous for Henry. He was a young Plantagenet directly descended from the House of York. Because of this, Edward was taken to the Tower of London. This was not unusual, for people had already grown accustomed to boys with the wrong blood in the wrong place disappearing behind those walls. Rumors of Edward's death spread, creating an opportunity for an impostor named Lambert Simnel to appear claiming to be Edward. In order to silence the rumor, Henry had the real Edward taken out of the tower and displayed publicly so that the people could see him, and then returned him inside once more. Simnel and his supporters were defeated, and the impersonator was spared, given a place working in the king's kitchens instead of a death sentence. In the year 1490, Henry confirmed Edward as the Earl of Warwick, a title that passed through his mother rather than through his father, whose lands had been taken. Meanwhile, Margaret, who was now about 14 years old, reached the age of marriage. To both care for and control her, Henry arranged for Margaret to marry his cousin Richard Pole, a man 14 or 15 years older than she was. Richard was a safe choice related to the king, loyal, steady, and without personal ambition. To many observers, this marriage seemed beneath Margaret's birth, for she was the daughter of a duke and the niece and grandniece of kings. Yet Richard, though not a commoner, did not match the rank she might once have expected. But the marriage appeared peaceful and calm, and for Margaret, after so many years of uncertainty, perhaps the feeling of safety was the most precious thing of all. The turbulence of her early life, the execution of Margaret Twinho, the instability of her father, the loss of her home, the disappearance of the princes, the fall of Richard III. The imprisonment of her brother had shaped her into someone who understood the fragility of security. Now she found herself in a household where there were no whispers of treason, no shifting alliances, no looming accusations. The quiet itself must have felt like a rare and fragile gift. Her marriage to Richard Pole also placed her nearer to the center of the royal world, but not in a way that threatened anyone. She was close enough to be observed, yet distant enough to be dismissed. She belonged, yet did not intrude. For a woman with her bloodline, this was the safest place to exist. The crown could look at her and see no danger, and Margaret, who had seen what danger brought, made no move to change this perception. She did not seek influence. She did not speak loudly. She did not position herself. She simply lived, and living quietly was its own form of survival. Edward, however, remained in the tower, separated from the life Margaret was now building. His existence continued to hover like a silent reminder that the past had not entirely faded. His name still carried weight even when locked away. And Margaret, though living outside the walls, lived with the knowledge that her brother's fate was tied to politics she could not control. The crown could decide his life, his future, or his death, and she could only watch from a distance. Thus, Margaret entered womanhood with a mixture of calm and shadow. Married, protected, watched, and yet still touched by the uncertainty of her lineage. Her wedding did not erase her past, yet it wrapped her in enough stability to let her breathe. And in a world where breath itself could be taken away by heritage, rumor, or suspicion, that quiet, steady breath was everything. The marriage between Margaret and Richard Pole was not a dazzling alliance, nor one that echoed loudly through history. Yet the storyteller allows the listener to sense the quiet peace within it. Margaret moved to live at Bachma House in Medmenham, which Richard considered his principal home. When Richard was required to carry out duties in Wales, Margaret often stayed at Staten Castle so she could be nearer to him, a small detail that suggests the two genuinely cared for one another. Then Margaret became pregnant and gave birth to her first child in the year 1492, a son who was given the name Henry after the king. After this came a long pause with no additional children, and the narrator offers two possibilities. One possibility is that Richard was too occupied with his many responsibilities. The other is that there may have been pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, children who never entered the written record and whose brief lives dissolved into silence. By the year 1499, Margaret gave birth to another son named Arthur, sharing the name of the Prince of Wales. During this period, Richard was increasingly entrusted with greater roles. He became Lord Chamberlain to Prince Arthur, and in that same year he was made a Knight of the Garter. It seemed as though Margaret's life had finally found a path that was no longer uneven. The walls around her were steady, her household orderly, her marriage calm, and her children growing. The tension and danger that had shadowed her childhood and early youth felt distant, softened, almost like a memory belonging to someone else. Yet the storyteller maintains a slow rhythm, reminding the listener that this tranquility was only a pause between larger storms. The peace that Margaret experienced was gentle but fragile. It rested on the goodwill of the king, the stability of the court, and the illusion that the past could remain buried. The listener senses that the calm cannot last forever, that something unseen is already beginning to stir beyond the edges of Margaret's quiet world. Richard's growing prominence intertwined Margaret's life more closely with the royal sphere once again. Though she did not seek influence, her husband's responsibilities placed her near those who watched bloodlines with wary eyes. Her children, particularly her sons, represented continuation, and continuation could be interpreted as possibility. Even without intention, Margaret's family stood in a position that history might one day deem threatening. Yet in these years, Margaret behaved exactly as a woman seeking safety would behave. She lived dutifully quietly without displaying ambition. She bore children, managed her household, and followed her husband where his obligations led him. The narrator draws the listener into the stillness of this period, allowing them to feel the warmth of a life that, for once, did not tremble beneath the weight of danger. But history does not remain still, and the world Margaret lived in was ruled by crowns that shifted, alliances that frayed, and whispers that could become accusations overnight. The storyteller lets the silence stretch, as though the breath of the narrative becomes slower, softer, preparing the listener for the return of turmoil. The peace Margaret experienced was real, yet temporary, like the gentle lull between tides. For even as Margaret raised her sons and followed the steady rhythm of domestic life, events beyond her control continued to form. The tower still held her brother. The memory of vanished princes still haunted the kingdom. The crown rested uneasily on Henry VII's head. Pretenders' rumors and foreign interests waited like wolves in distant shadows. And all of these forces belonged to the same world that Margaret had been born into, the world she could never truly leave, no matter how quietly she lived. The narrator does not rush. Instead, the words drift like evening light across stone floors, letting the listener feel how history can fold back upon a life that tries to escape it. Margaret's calm was a harbor, but not a final refuge. Ahead, the tide of events would rise again, and her name, her quiet, unwilling name, would once more be pulled toward the center of danger, toward accusations, toward the peril that follows those born with blood traced to kings. The peace was real, but fleeting, and the story waits breath held for the next turn. A great upheaval arrived when another pretender appeared, Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the prince who had vanished from the Tower of London. Warbeck was intelligent, persuasive, and charismatic, and he caused many to believe that he truly was the lost prince. When Warbeck was captured and brought to the Tower in the year 1499, he convinced the jailers to allow him to share quarters with Edward, the brother of Margaret. The two young men became close, and although no one could truly know how much Edward participated, both were accused of planning an escape. To King Henry VII, the mere intention of escape meant an ambition to overthrow the throne. A swift trial took place on the 21st day of November in the year 1499, and only 1 week later, on the 28th day of November, Edward was executed for treason. Margaret lost the only remaining member of her immediate family, even though they had been separated since childhood. The storyteller allows the listener to feel the coldness of that loss, not the pain of separation between two who shared a life together, but the grief of someone who understood that her bloodline was being erased piece by piece from history. More children were born to Margaret in the years that followed. Reginald was born in the year 1500, Geoffrey in the year 1501, and Ursula around the year 1504. But the joy those children brought was soon shrouded in shadow, because in that same year, 1504, Richard, the husband who had provided safety for Margaret, died suddenly. No cause was recorded, only that his death arrived unexpectedly, like a cold breath slipping through a door not fully closed. Margaret became a widow at the age of 31, without property, with 5 children, and with a future that dissolved into uncertainty. The security she had gathered slowly, the calm she had cherished, the fragile shelter she had found, all vanished in a moment. She now stood once more exposed to the shifting forces of power lineage and vulnerability. Her life, which had finally seemed steady, was thrown once again into instability. The narrator moves slowly here, letting the listener feel the weight of that shift, as though a candle flame has dimmed and the room has turned colder. To survive, Margaret was forced to send Reginald into the church, an accepted choice for a younger son at the time, yet one that planted bitterness deep within him. What had been a practical solution for Margaret became for Reginald a wound that lingered through his life. He would one day remind his mother of it, accusing her of providing for his siblings while leaving him to the clergy. The storyteller does not rush past this moment. Instead, the narration pauses, letting the listener feel the sorrow of a mother whose decisions were shaped not by desire, but by necessity. Margaret did not choose the direction of her life. At every turn, she was pushed by politics, by death, by inheritance laws, by suspicion, by the crown, by forces far larger than herself. Her childhood had been marked by the execution of a woman falsely accused. Her youth had been shaped by the death of a father condemned as a traitor. Her brother had been imprisoned, displayed, doubted, and finally executed. And now her husband, the one person who had offered quiet stability, was gone. The storyteller breathed slowly through this chapter, allowing the listener to recognize how each step Margaret took was not truly a step she chose. She moved because she was pressed forward. She survived because there was no other option. Her lineage had never been a ladder she climbed. It was a current that carried her where she did not wish to go. 5 children depended on her. No land supported her. No wealth protected her. And yet she continued, not fiercely, not triumphantly, but steadily, quietly, like someone walking through snow that deepens with every step. And here, the narrator lets the silence stretch so the listener can feel the truth beneath the story. Margaret's life was not shaped by ambition, but by endurance. Not by power, but by survival. Not by choice, but by the relentless weight of history pressing down upon her. Without a home and without an income, Margaret was forced to live at Sion Abbey as a guest of the nuns, not as a member of the religious order, yet no longer a noblewoman with property and authority. The narrator slows the rhythm, allowing the listener to feel the emptiness that lingered in the cold stone corridors. Margaret moved through a world that was neither hers nor familiar, a world that offered shelter without belonging, safety without dignity. The halls were quiet, the days subdued, and the life she had known slipped further away, leaving behind only the weight of responsibility and the echo of what had been lost. Then, a new turning point arrived in the year 1509, when Henry VIII ascended the throne and married Catherine of Aragon. Once more, Margaret was called back to court, becoming a lady in the household of the new queen. The shift was subtle but profound. After years of being pushed downward, she was lifted again into visibility, into proximity with power, into the warmth of a world she had once been forced to leave behind. The narrator lets the moment unfold without fanfare, like a candle slowly rekindling in a room that had been dark for too long. Then, in the year 1512, Margaret was restored to the title of Countess of Salisbury and regained all the lands that had once belonged to her brother. Though she was required to pay 5,000 marks for her restoration, the terms were far more lenient than those imposed upon male nobles who had been stripped of their estates. Margaret became the first woman in the 16th century to hold a peerage in her own right, and only one other woman would do the same in that century, Anne Boleyn. The storyteller does not emphasize this, but lets the information drift gently, yet the listener can feel the quiet weight of irony settling beneath it. History was forming a paradox around Margaret. The more she stood upright, the longer the shadow of her fate stretched behind her. She managed her estates with such skill that by the year 1538, she ranked among the 5 wealthiest peers of her station. She oversaw lands revenue, legal matters, and domestic management with a competence that rivaled the most capable men of her time. She selected stewards carefully, many of them women, and where the law barred her, she placed her sons to act in her stead. Her household became a center of stability, refinement, and influence, not through ambition, but through the quiet strength of survival. Yet the narrator allows the listener to sense that this rise carried with it a subtle tightening of threads. Wealth drew attention, Status drew scrutiny, and lineage. Margaret's ancient, unbroken, dangerous lineage drew fear. The gentleness of the storytelling does not soften the truth that lies beneath it. The higher Margaret was lifted, the more precarious her position became. Her success appeared to restore what life had taken from her, but it also placed her once again in the gaze of the crown, the court, and the political winds that shifted unpredictably. Margaret did not seek prominence. She did not use her wealth to cultivate power. She did not whisper in corridors nor maneuver behind closed doors. She lived with dignity, generosity, and restraint. But history does not always punish the ambitious. Sometimes it punishes those whom ambition merely touches from afar. The listener can feel that the peace Margaret now experienced was textured with something faint yet chilling, like distant thunder muffled by thick walls. Her restored title, her lands, her income, her respected position. They seemed like justice, like balance, like the world finally acknowledging what had been wrongly taken. But the narrator lets the words float slow and measured, as if to remind the listener that life often returns what it has stolen, only to reclaim something far greater in the end. For Margaret, the return of status was not the beginning of safety. It was the beginning of the path that would one day lead to the block, to the axe, to the most brutal execution of Henry VIII's reign. The listener may not yet see the end, but they can feel its distant breath, cold and patient waiting. The children of Margaret began to rise into positions of importance. Arthur, the second son of Margaret, entered the service of Margaret Tudor in the year 1514, joining her entourage as she traveled and fulfilled her duties as a royal princess. Later, he became a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, a position that placed him near the heart of the Tudor court. Reginald, another of Margaret's sons, studied in Padua, where he was educated among scholars and churchmen. Although he did not become an ordained priest, he was granted several positions within the church positions that reflected both his intellect and the influence of his family name. Ursula, Margaret's daughter, was even proposed as a potential bride for the Duke of Milan, a match that would have connected her to one of the most prominent noble houses in Europe. Instead, she married Henry Stafford in the year 1518. These developments suggested that Margaret and her family had been welcomed once more into the currents of royal favor, as though the shadows of earlier years had finally lifted. But beneath the surface, change was forming again. Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England, and a close friend of Margaret, remained a significant presence in her life. In the year 1518, Margaret was involved in a dispute over land with the king, and the ruling was not in her favor. Yet only 2 years later, in the year 1520, she was appointed governess to Princess Mary, the daughter of Catherine and Henry VIII. Between Margaret and Mary, a deep bond formed, one that resembled the bond between mother and child. Mary, still young and vulnerable, looked to Margaret for stability, affection, and guidance. Margaret offered gentleness, structure, and the comfort of a familiar faith. The connection grew naturally, quietly, without political intention, yet it would become one of the reasons Margaret was later seen as a threat. Loyalty to Mary meant loyalty to Catherine, and loyalty to Catherine would soon stand against the will of the king. In the year 1525, Anne Boleyn entered the center of royal attention. The court divided, not slowly but sharply, into those who supported Catherine and those who supported Anne. The future of the kingdom began to tilt. Henry VIII's desire for Anne meant he would seek to cast aside Catherine, overturn his marriage, and challenge the authority of the church. Margaret chose her side without hesitation. She stood with Catherine the Queen, who had welcomed her back into court, the woman she respected, the friend she would not abandon. She did not speak loudly, yet her allegiance was unmistakable. And from that moment forward, her presence was no longer viewed as harmless. The atmosphere around her began to shift. People who once greeted her warmly now offered polite distance. Conversations ended when she approached. Whispers replaced familiarity. Margaret had wealth, restored lands, respected children, and one of the oldest bloodlines in England. Combined with her loyalty to Catherine and her influence over Mary, she became a figure who could be imagined as a rallying point. She did not intend it. She did not encourage it. She did nothing but remain constant, yet constancy in a court that demanded alignment with the king's changing desires became its own form of defiance. Henry VIII's pursuit of Anne Boleyn required not only a new queen but the dismantling of the old one. Those who stood with Catherine stood against the king's wishes, even if they had no political ambition. Margaret's loyalty marked her not because of action, but because of association. Her lineage made her visible, her status made her credible, and her bond with Mary made her symbolically powerful. These elements combined quietly, forming the beginning of the danger that would one day surround her. Margaret's life, which had seemed settled, began once again to move towards uncertainty. Not through rebellion, not through speech, not through ambition, but through the simple reality of who she stood beside. The choice she made to remain faithful to Catherine would echo through every chapter that followed, and that echo would grow louder with time. In the year 1538, after the Pilgrimage of Grace had been crushed and the court was stretched tight with suspicion, Geoffrey, the son of Margaret, was accused of corresponding with Reginald. The accusation was vague without proof or clarity, yet it was enough for Thomas Cromwell to act. Geoffrey was arrested in the month of August, and under questioning he stated that his brother Henry Lord Montague had known about the letters. That single admission brought the entire family under suspicion. By the month of November, Margaret was arrested and taken to the Tower of London along with her young grandson Henry, who was only about 15 years old. She was more than 60 years old, had never acted against the crown, and yet she was placed in the fortress that had become the final destination for those whose bloodlines were judged dangerous. The interrogation began on the 12th day of November. Margaret replied calmly, clearly without fear. William Fitzwilliam. One of the men who questioned her did not like her, yet even he acknowledged that she showed unexpected strength and refused to bend under pressure. Her answers did not waver. There was no panic in her voice, no confession, no crack in her composure. But strength was not protection, and truth was not a shield. The machinery of accusation had already begun to move, and it did not require guilt to continue. By the month of January, in the year 1539, Geoffrey was released and pardoned. But Henry, the eldest son of Margaret, was found guilty of treason and executed. The blow was swift and final. Margaret and her grandson were brought before Parliament and stripped of all titles and lands, just as her father had once been. The cycle repeated itself generation after generation, as though her blood carried not privilege, but punishment. The estates that had been restored to her, the honors she had held, the dignity she had rebuilt, everything was taken once more, leaving nothing but confinement and uncertainty. Thomas Cromwell produced what he called evidence, a tunic embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ. He declared that it proved Margaret supported the idea of Reginald marrying Mary and taking the throne of England. No one truly believed the garment was hers, and no one believed the accusation was real. Yet no one dared to stand against Cromwell or the king. Silence became agreement, and agreement became condemnation. The walls around Margaret closed in, not because of any act she had committed, but because of what others feared she might represent. Margaret remained in the Tower. She was not tortured, but she was contained. She was treated with a degree of respect, yet she was a prisoner. Her age, her composure, her nobility, her innocence, none of these mattered. She was dangerous, not for what she had done, but for who she was. A woman with Plantagenet blood. A woman connected to Catherine of Aragon. A woman loved by Princess Mary. A woman whose son opposed the king's religious reforms. A woman whose lineage could be used as a banner if the kingdom fractured. Months passed, and the sense of waiting settled like frost. Margaret did not know whether she would be released or executed. She did not know whether the king remembered her existence or had forgotten her entirely. She did not know whether her silence would save her or doom her. She only knew that her life was no longer her own. The chambers of the Tower held her, the air grew still around her, and time moved slowly like a candle burning in a room without windows. The cruelest truth was not spoken aloud. Yet it lingered with every passing day. Margaret was not being punished for any deed she had done, but for what others might imagine she could do. Her guilt was theoretical, her danger speculative, her crime imagined. From the moment Geoffrey spoke her eldest son's name, her fate became fixed. The path ahead narrowed, and there was no turning back. Her story continued, but its ending had already been written long before she reached it. Though stripped of her titles, Margaret was not treated like an ordinary prisoner. The king paid for her lodging and food, and this led many to believe that Henry VIII did not intend to have her killed. In the year 1540, Thomas Cromwell, the man responsible for her arrest, was executed, and this created an even stronger impression that Margaret might survive. By the month of March in the year 1541, records show that she still had servants, new clothing, and care appropriate to her rank. The days passed slowly with a quiet that seemed to suggest safety, yet beneath that quiet was something far more chilling than torture hope. Hope that she might live, hope that the king had forgotten her, hope that time would carry her gently into old age instead of toward the scaffold. Inside her chamber, carved into the cold stone wall, were words that revealed the depth of her isolation. The traitor must die on the scaffold. I am no traitor. No, not I. My loyalty stands steadfast, and therefore I shall not go to the scaffold, not one step, as you shall see. Lord, I beseech you, have mercy on me and save me. The words stood silently, without decoration, without flourish, without desperation. They were steady, like the hand of someone who had endured too long to crumble now. There was no ornament, only certainty. A woman past 60 years of age, alone in a fortress built for endings, carving her innocence into unyielding stone. Outwardly, her situation appeared calm, but news from across Europe stirred unease in the king's mind. Reginald, her son, was urging foreign rulers to stand against England. He wrote, he traveled, he spoke against the king's break from Rome. He sought alliances. He was seen as a genuine threat. And in the mind of a monarch accustomed to resolving fear with execution, even one thread of suspicion could become a sentence of death. Margaret had done nothing. She had written nothing. She had taken part in no plot, but she was the mother of Reginald, and in that year, in that climate, under that king, that alone was enough. The months inside the tower unfolded heavy and slow. Margaret aged quietly within its walls. Her body weakened, but her composure did not. She prayed, she waited, she endured. Every sound in the corridor might have been freedom and might have been death. Each sunrise could have signaled release or final judgment. The uncertainty was its own form of punishment. She had lived through kings, rebellions, disappearances, accusations, forfeitures, and the deaths of nearly everyone who shared her blood. Yet this waiting was heavier than all of it, because there was no action she could take, no word she could speak, no proof she could offer that would change what was coming. The king's fear grew sharper. Reginald's influence in Europe spread wider. Whispers of foreign support for him reached England. Rumors circled that the king was being mocked abroad, defied, challenged. Pride mixed with paranoia, and the thought formed simple and brutal. If the son was unreachable, the mother could be struck down in his place. It did not matter that she opposed no one. It did not matter that she was elderly. It did not matter that she had once been honored, restored, welcomed. The past held no weight. Only fear remained. Margaret was not informed of her sentence. There was no trial. No charges were formally proven. No testimony was heard. There was only a decision made far from her sight, sealed without her voice. The tower did not tell her. Days continued as before, quiet and still, so that the moment of death would arrive without preparation. Servants continued to attend her meals, continued to appear. The illusion of safety continued to wrap itself around her like a shroud. Her innocence had never been questioned by those who knew her. Her loyalty had never wavered. Her faith had never faltered. But England was no longer ruled by loyalty or faith or justice. It was ruled by fear, and fear required sacrifice. Margaret became that sacrifice, not because of her deeds, but because of her name, her blood, and the actions of a son she had not seen in years. The silence surrounding her fate deepened, stretching long and cold like a breath held before the blade descends. The path before her had already narrowed to a single end, and nothing could turn it aside. On the morning of the 27th day of May in the year 1541, Margaret was told that she would be executed within 1 hour. There was no trial. There was no sentence read aloud. There was no formal declaration, only an order delivered without explanation, without ceremony, without even the pretense of justice. She was stunned and asked what crime she had been condemned for, but no one answered her. The silence around her was absolute. This was not the end of a rebel or a conspirator or a traitor. It was the end of someone whose only crime was to exist, to be born into a lineage feared by a king who no longer trusted anything but the axe. What awaited her outside was worse still. The usual scaffold was not erected. Instead, a low block was placed hastily on the ground, as though her death did not merit the dignity of preparation. The executioner who normally served the tower was absent and away. In his place stood a young boy, inexperienced, holding an axe that seemed too large for him. His hands trembled. His stance was uncertain. The air was thick with the knowledge that what was about to happen would not be swift. Margaret prayed. She asked that those present remember her to Princess Mary. Then she placed her head upon the block. The axe did not fall true. The first blow struck her shoulder. The second blow glanced against her skull. Blow after blow followed, not clean, not precise, but clumsy and panicked. Her body recoiled with each strike. There was no mercy in the strokes, only fear. Fear from the boy swinging the blade. Fear from those watching, fear that no one could halt what had already begun. No one knows how long it took for her to die. No one knows at which stroke she lost consciousness. It is certain only that at least several blows landed while she was still alive and could feel them. The scene was quiet, but not peaceful. There was no crowd. There were no proclamations. There were no shouts of triumph or condemnation. Only the dull, sickening rhythm of metal striking flesh and bone again and again, while an elderly woman, innocent of all charges, endured the most brutal execution of Henry VIII's reign. It was not a death shaped by hatred, but by negligence, indifference, and fear. It was the kind of death that revealed not the guilt of the condemned, but the cruelty of the state that ordered it. Margaret had lived more than 60 years. She had outlasted kings, rebellions, betrayals, and the erasure of her family line. She had been restored to honor, then stripped of it again. She had raised children, buried loved ones, and survived the slow grinding machinery of suspicion. Yet it was here, on a patch of ground, without a scaffold, under the trembling hands of a boy with an axe, that her life ended. There was no coffin prepared for her. No rites were performed. Her body was placed without ceremony in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, among others who had fallen to the will of the crown. No marker bore her name. No inscription honored her memory. She vanished into the stone floor the way her family had vanished from history, piece by piece, one generation at a time. Henry VIII lived for 6 more years after ordering her death. Reginald, the son whose existence had helped doom her, became a cardinal. Princess Mary never forgot her. And when Mary finally ascended the throne, she ordered that Margaret be remembered as innocent and that the charges against her be declared void. But the void could not call her back. The truth came too late. The justice came too late. The restoration came too late. Margaret had never plotted. She had never schemed. She had never sought the crown nor encouraged anyone else to seek it. She had endured quietly, loyally, and faithfully. Yet her final moments were filled not with dignity, but with the clumsy terror of an executioner too young to wield the blade that ended her life. It was not the death of a traitor, but the death of a woman who was killed because a king feared the shadow of her bloodline. And it was the executioner's inexperience, more than the order itself, more than the accusation, more than the imprisonment, that made the tragedy unbearable. Margaret's body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower, the same resting place for many others who had fallen under the weight of royal power. There was no stone with her name, no carved remembrance, no prayer spoken aloud. She disappeared into the floor as though the earth itself had been instructed to forget she had lived. When the news reached Reginald, he spoke only one sentence, saying that he was now the proud son of a martyr, and then he closed his door and remained alone for 1 hour. A mother who had once sent her son into the church so he might survive was now dead because of the son whose path led far beyond her reach. The tragedy rested quietly in that single detail. Time moved forward, and generations passed. In the year 1886, Margaret was beatified by the Pope, recognized as innocent, recognized as having died for faith rather than for treason. It was an acknowledgement that arrived centuries too late, an honor that did not soften the blade that struck her, nor erase the terror of her final mourning. Yet it marked her name with dignity again, the dignity that had been stolen, restored only when no one remained who could benefit from the truth. Looking back across her life, the shape of her story revealed itself clearly. Margaret had been born into royal blood. Her lineage connected her to kings, queens, and the thrones of England. By birth, she might have married a prince, lived in wealth, raised her children in safety, and passed into old age without fear. Yet her father's downfall dragged the entire family into danger, stripping them of status, scattering them, and forcing her into a marriage below her rank. Her husband died, leaving her widowed at 31 with 5 children and no income. Her eldest brother was killed. Her estates were taken. Her security dissolved again and again. She did not seek influence, but influence found her. She did not enter political struggle, but political struggle surrounded her. She did not choose sides to gain advantage, but simply remained loyal to those who had shown her kindness. That loyalty was enough to condemn her. She became entangled in the religious conflict of the age without lifting a finger, without writing a word, without speaking a sentence that could be called treason. It was enough that others thought she might become a symbol for resistance. It was enough that her bloodline carried a claim she never desired. It was enough that she was the mother of Reginald. History formed a cruel paradox around her. She was seen as dangerous, not because of any action she took, but because of what others imagined she could inspire. She had been efficient in managing her lands, careful in governing her household, steady in her faith, and loyal to those she served. Yet none of that remained in memory. The world remembered instead the execution, the blows that missed the axe that struck again and again, the image of an old woman, dying not swiftly but slowly beneath the shaking hands of a boy. Even those who supported the king were unsettled by the brutality. The violence was too clumsy, too prolonged, too visibly wrong. It did not look like justice or necessity or protection of the realm. It looked like fear, striking wildly, unable to steady its grip. Her death lingered in the minds of witnesses, lingering the way a nightmare lingers after waking heavy and cold. As years passed, her story faded, but the manner of her death did not. It remained like a shard of glass embedded in the historical record, small, sharp, and impossible to remove. She did not live as a rebel, yet she died like one. She did not conspire, yet she was killed as though she had. She did not seek power, yet power crushed her. Her life showed how a crown could fear even the quiet. Her death showed how a kingdom could destroy someone who asked for nothing. And her memory settled into history not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as a wound, silent, cold, and unfinished. And now, as the story of Margaret gently comes to a close, you may notice the final images fading into the dark. No more heavy axe, no more rough block of wood, no more frightened faces gathered around a cold execution yard. What remains is only a soft mist, as though history itself has chosen to settle quietly, smoothing the sharpest edges of tragedy. Margaret, with her life of upheaval, with losses arriving one after another, with her peace stolen by a power she never sought, now seems to rest in a place far calmer than the one where her life ended. Looking back across her journey, one truth becomes clear. History is not always shaped by those who shout the loudest. Sometimes it is shaped by those who stand silently at the edge, enduring, continuing, and keeping a gentle heart, even when the world grows hard. Margaret did not fight, did not chase power, did not seek a crown, yet that softness made her more vulnerable to the turning of the age. And so the story leaves in our hands a quiet question. How many other lives have been drowned, not because of what they did, but because of what others feared they might become? The rhythm slows, and you may feel your eyelids growing heavier, as though the old pages of history are closing softly. Perhaps the final message is this: sometimes strength is not in resisting, but in remaining yourself even when the winds rise. And the peace we seek, even if slow, even if late, can still arrive, like tonight, settling gently around you. So before you drift into sleep, let your mind float lightly like a small boat on still water. Let the story dissolve, soften, and become a slow and steady breath guiding you into quietness, wishing you a deep, peaceful, soothing night. And if you'd like to wander into more stories like this, subscribe so that each evening we can meet again in these sleepy, gentle, whispering journeys through history. Sleep well.